My name is Nitifafa Abute. I'm an assistant professor in soil and nutrient management specialist at the University of Tennessee. I'm located at the West Tennessee Research and Education Center. Still talking on soil sampling and testing consideration for optimum crop yield. We'll look at fertilizer recommendation. And my talk on this subject matter will focus on the different fertilizer recommendation philosophy and work that has been done in Tennessee regarding this subject matter. So the three most widely used fertilizer recommendation philosophies are sufficiency level, also known as feed the plant, build and maintain, also known as feed the soil, and the basic cation saturation ratio. I will go through two of these philosophies in details in subsequent slides. But the issue of fertilizer recommendation philosophy is very important because if you take a soil sample, the same soil sample that is sent to different soil testing labs, the labs might each recommend different fertilizer to put out. And this philosophy issue is one of the reasons why you see these differences in recommendations. So it's very important to take a look at it. So the first philosophy I'll talk about is the sufficiency level. The sufficiency level philosophy recommends fertilizer that will contribute to the crop nutrient requirements during the growing season. So if you look at this box here, right here, the box represents the total nutrient requirement of the plant during the growing season. The area that is shaded brown, that is the plant available nutrient in the soil, the current plant available nutrient in the soil. And then the area in green is the supplemental nutrient that is required by plant to get that optimum yield that we're looking for. So University of Tennessee has four distinct soil test ranking or soil test indexes, some labs may call it. And with the low, if your soil tests low, that means that when fertilizer is recommended to compensate for the nutrient, crop response is assured. Okay, for a medium testing soil, again, there's a possibility of crop response. We do recommend fertilizer for that. But for high and very high, particularly very high, it's because crop response is unlikely, fertilizer is not recommended. And this is one of the distinct differences between the sufficiency philosophy and in the build and maintain philosophy, which I will talk about next. So next up is the build and maintain philosophy. And this states the approach of first building up the soil fertility from low and medium soil test ranking to high and very high. So the critical level here is any soil test ranking below medium. And in between the critical level and the maintenance level is the high soil test ranking. So with this philosophy, you build up your nutrient to the critical level, and then between the critical level and then the maintenance level, which is high, ideally you wouldn't expect or you would see marginal crop response whenever you add additional nutrients. But in this philosophy, they recommend additional nutrients. And the rationale behind this philosophy is that when the crop is harvested and removed from the field, nutrient associated with the crop is also removed. Hence, the need to maintain this nutrient. And this approach uses yield goal provided by the farmer to determine the nutrient removal amount. This approach requires more fertilizer and also can increase production costs and reduce profit margin. Next, we'll look at some trials that have been established to compare different fertilizer recommendation philosophies. So this work was done by Dr. Hugh Savoy in the early 2000s. So farm trials were established in Lawrence, Lincoln County, and they collected soil samples and sent them to three different soil testing labs. University of Tennessee soil testing lab for UT recommendations, and then recommendation from a commercial lab in Tennessee and a commercial lab in a neighboring state. So soil samples were collected from the production field. The samples were mixed thoroughly, processed, and then divided into three identical samples for submission. And these were shipped to the various soil testing labs. Let's look at some results. So in terms of the fertilizer and lime recommendation, it was clearly evident that uh, the soil test values as well as the recommendation, the lime and fertilizer recommendation provided by the commercial lab, lab A and lab B, were generally higher compared to UT. Lab B, which is the in-state lab, was had, uh, or let me put it this way, Lab B, which is an in-state lab, was a little the fertility recommendation was a little bit closer to University of Tennessee recommended lab. And Lab B, which is out of state, you could see that the soil test numbers were a bit higher, and then the soil test recommendation was also higher. The soil test numbers were lower and the recommendation was higher. If we look at the cost, obviously, since recommendations from the commercial lab were higher, you'd expect the cost to follow a similar trend. So in Lawrence County, you could see somewhere between 30 to 40% increase in fertilizer costs compared to University of Tennessee. And then in Lincoln County, you could see 4 to 35% increase in fertilizer costs. Now let's look at our yield. So this is the corn yield in pounds per acre. In both counties, there was no significant differences between the three. There was no significant differences in grain yield between the three recommendations. Uh, University of Tennessee recommendation provided yield that were as good as the more costly commercial about recommendation. Also, more recently, a study was conducted by Dr. Duncan and other UT scientists when we looked at different fertilizer recommendation philosophies based on variable rate application. And this study was conducted in a field that was managed in the corn soybean rotation. in Madison County, Tennessee. Three treatments were evaluated. Um, Maintenance based approach on 0.5 acre, and then sufficiency level based approach on a 0.5 acre and a 10-acre grade. So if we look at the fertilizer recommendations, so soil samples were collected as usual, sent to labs, and they provided the recommendations. You could clearly see that the recommendations for the maintenance were slightly higher, the nitrogen, but as you go to calcium and phosphorus, that's when you see huge differences. Just look at the F level, um, several percentage higher. For the soybean, a similar trend was observed. We look at fertilizer recommendations, potassium and uh, phosphorus were relatively high. So if you compare the yield, this graph shows you the yield for 2014, 2015, 2016, and 2017. Bear in mind that this was uh, corn, soybean, potato, so on the y-axis, we have average yield in bushels per acre, and on the x-axis, we have the corn year interaction for corn and soybeans. There was no differences between the fertilizer recommendation philosophy. There was no significant difference. If we look at the cost in terms of input cost, for corn, be it in 2014 to 2016, there was no significant difference. And if you start looking at soybeans, and you can see that when you're using the maintenance approach to soybeans, it helps in terms of cost. So pretty much the tell that the sufficiency level approach saves you money, and in terms of grain yield, it produces as good as the maintenance approach. Thank you. And if you have any questions, you can send it to the contact information below. Have a good